The flight attendant's voice trembled with practiced calm, but her eyes betrayed irritation as she stood in the narrow aisle. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your boarding pass again. Seat 12 Farad is already taken." All eyes in the cabin turned. The woman in the gray hoodie, face half hidden, a scar running like a shadow down her cheek, did not move. She simply sat there, hands folded, gaze lowered. She could have argued. She could have explained. But instead, silence was her answer. The businessman in the next row smirked, adjusting his tie. "She probably sneaked in here," he muttered, loud enough for half the row to hear. His laughter was joined by a ripple of whispers, that low murmur of suspicion that spreads like wildfire when people smell weakness. She didn't react. She stayed still, shoulders straight, eyes fixed on the window. Beyond it, the tarmac shimmered under the Sunday. Seat 12 Farad. The number mattered more than anyone around her could know. The attendant frowned, pressing again. "Ma'am, you need to comply." And then, just as the tension tightened, something unexpected happened. Two men in the back, uniformed in civilian clothes, but carrying themselves with military rigidity, exchanged glances. Their eyes had locked not on her hoodie, not on her silence, but on a patch of fabric barely visible at her wrist. Faded, worn, the kind of insignia no civilian would recognize. But they did. And suddenly, everything about this quiet woman in seat 12 Farad was about to shift. She was Captain Eleanor Vance. Once. Before the scar. Before the silence. Before the call sign that still echoed through hangars and flight decks, carried in whispers like a legend. Spectre. She had been the one pilots followed into storms they weren't sure they'd leave alive. The one who flew not for glory, but because she knew that if she didn't, someone else would pay the price. She had watched too many of them pay it anyway. Now she sat, her frame smaller than the myth, her voice withheld. Civilians saw a scar, a hoodie, and silence. They saw someone out of place. But the sky remembered her, and so did those who had once listened for that call sign through static and chaos, desperate for her voice telling them they weren't alone. Years earlier, her world had been fire and steel. The cockpit smelled always of jet fuel and iron. The roar of the engines pressed against her bones. But inside that fragile shell of titanium and glass, she had felt untouchable. Her squadron had been her family, her brothers and sisters stitched together by fear, courage, and the promise that they would bring each other home. She had learned to fly with her father's voice in her memory himself, a pilot who never returned from his last deployment. She carried that absence like a compass, every mission, a silent conversation with him. And then came the mission no one spoke of publicly. The one that ended with fire licking across the desert sky, radio silence from the wingmen she couldn't save, and her own birds spiraling down in a storm of shrapnel. The scar on her cheek was not from the crash that healed. The real wound was the empty locker beside hers. When she returned, the folded flag, the silence that followed. When the Navy retired her early, she disappeared from headlines. But she didn't vanish. She carried her ghosts quietly, living small, invisible. She thought anonymity would protect her, but fate has a way of dragging the unseen into light. Back in the airplane cabin, the murmurs grew crueler. "She's probably one of those fakes," someone whispered. "Stealing valor. She looks unstable. Flight risk." The flight attendant's lips tightened. She leaned closer, her tone sharpened with authority. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. You cannot sit here without proof." The woman in 12 Farad finally raised her eyes. And though she said nothing, her gaze carried something that made the attendant falter a weight, a depth, a history too vast to measure. The businessman snorted, breaking the spell. "What, cat got your tongue? If you don't belong here, move." Still, she stayed silent. The military men in the back had risen now, moving down the aisle. Passengers shifted, unsure whether to intervene or to watch. One of them leaned down, not to the flight attendant, not to the businessman, but directly to her. His voice dropped, steady, reverent. "Spectre?" It was not a question of suspicion. It was recognition. Her eyes flickered 1 second of acknowledgement. And just like that, the air shifted. The man straightened, his own posture rigid as though on parade. "Seat 12 Farrad is taken," he said firmly, this time to the attendant. "By Captain Eleanor Vance. Call sign Spectre." The businessman laughed. "Oh, come on. You expect us to believe that?" But then the second man, already standing at attention, gave a crisp salute, the kind that needed no words. And in the cockpit, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. To our passengers seated near 12 Farrad, treat her with respect. You're flying with a legend today." The shock rolled through the cabin like thunder. Whispers turned to silence. Judgment curdled into shame. The businessman's smirk melted, his cheeks flushing red. He looked away, suddenly small in his suit. But the true moment of reckoning came minutes later, when the jet reached cruising altitude. The captain's voice returned, more personal this time. "To the crew and passengers on this flight, we've just received an escort. If you look out the left windows, you'll see 2 F-22 Raptors flying in formation with us. They requested permission to join once they heard who we had on board." Gasps filled the cabin, faces pressed to glass. And there they were, 2 sleek predators of the sky, wings tilting in salute, their presence impossible to ignore. The scarred woman, in 12 Farrad, did not move, but her lips trembled with something between sorrow and pride. One of the pilot's voices broke through the radio, audible only in the cockpit but relayed softly by the captain to the passengers. "Spectre, ma'am, this is Viper and Ghost. Permission to fly with you today?" Passengers could not hear her answer, but they saw her lift one hand slowly, palm pressed against the glass, the faintest nod of acknowledgement. It was enough. The Raptors dipped in perfect synchronization, an aerial bow. And in that moment, every passenger who had doubted, mocked, or judged fell into silence. Not forced silence, reverent silence. 3 quotes lingered in the cabin that day, words not shouted but spoken like promises. From the soldier who first recognized her. "Respect is not given, it's recognized." From the captain over the intercom. "Some heroes don't announce themselves, they just take their seat and carry the sky with them." And from the quiet woman herself, whispered only to the window, carried off by the roar of engines. "The fallen still fly with me, always." When the plane landed, no one rushed to stand. No one crowded the aisles. Instead, as she rose from 12 Farrad, the cabin filled with something greater than applause. Every passenger stood at attention. Rows of strangers, offering the honor she never asked for but always deserved. The businessman lowered his eyes, unable to meet hers. His shame was his own punishment. She walked off without a word, the scar catching the sunlight, her silence heavier than any speech. The F-22 second remained overhead until her feet touched the ground. Only then did they break away into the clouds, disappearing like guardians who had fulfilled their duty. And so the story of Seat 12 Farrad became more than a flight. It became a reminder that the people we dismiss may carry histories vast enough to humble nations. That silence does not mean weakness, but sometimes the deepest strength. It became a story whispered long after the plane's wheels kissed the runway. A story passengers told their families, their children, their grandchildren, because they had seen it with their own eyes. The day a scarred woman in a hoodie sat in Seat 12 Farrad, and the sky itself bowed to her. Heroes don't always look the part. They don't always speak the part. But when the truth surfaces, the world remembers to stand. And to those watching now, wherever you are, remember this. Dignity is battles of all. Where are you watching from tonight? What does this story mean to you? Share your thoughts below. And if you believe stories like these should never be forgotten, subscribe for more. Because heroes walk among us. Sometimes, they're just sitting in Seat 12 Farrad.